Okay, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar. Tonight we're talking about how houses can be destroyed by fire. I'd like to first of all acknowledge the traditional owners of this country, past, present and emerging, and also just notice how enthusiastically this country is responding to the rain that we're getting. It's looking pretty impressive from my place. Tonight we're going to be talking about the issues that are involved in the interface, in particular between your house and the bush, but a lot of other information that is going to be useful for those of us who are really thinking very carefully about how we're going to protect our houses going forward. I think that the enthusiasm with which the bush is recovering is really something that we need to consider for the next few years, and in a sense that's what this fuel management, this series of fuel management webinars is about, thinking about what we really need to do with, well, it's forest, it's bush, it's not just fuel, what we need to do with it to give ourselves a little bit more protection. So we felt that over the next few months, we would just keep on throwing information at you to help all of us make informed decisions about protecting Mallacoota. Helping us tonight in the discussion is Steve Pascoe and Gail Cumming. Steve is a volunteer. Many of you will know him. He's a disaster recovery mentor and a bushfire recovery facilitator. And he's been working with us in Mallacoota on and off for the last couple of years. First of all with the fuel management group, and latterly in the recovery. And also we have with us tonight Gail Cumming, who is a community-based bushfire management facilitator, and she works under the Safer Together program. So thanks, Steve and Gail. Thanks for coming on board, and you'll be assisting us with the questions. And Steve, I'll throw it open to you, and you can introduce our guest.
Terrific. Thanks, Lyn. I'd like to introduce Justin Leonard. Justin is the research leader, bushfire adaptation with the CSIRO. He's got 26 years at CSIRO, and his career is focused on understanding how houses are affected by and survive after bushfire events. That's a lot of his research. I've known Justin since I was a little boy. He was even littler, probably over 20 years. And I've learnt most of what I know about bushfires and houses from Justin and what makes up the risk. And I kind of think he's kind of the Yoda of bushfire and house survival in Australia. He is the man to go to, which makes him pretty busy at the moment. So the way to work tonight will work is that Justin will talk for 20 minutes. We'll then take a break for questions. Then Justin will come back on and with these another 20-minute session, and then we'll be followed with final questions. So Justin, over to you.
Thanks very much, Steve. I'll just share my screen. I've got a bit of a PowerPoint to take you all through. So let's focus on the final stage of bushfires arriving at the interface and impacting houses. The way I define that is fairly generically, in that we have a large urban interface with a nominal house in the middle. I guess all of our work in our research team is actually focused from this perspective of what it's like to experience a fire from the house's perspective. So how does the fire express itself out of the bush and impact a house? What processes does it go through? What condition is it in when the fire turns up? So I guess to unpack that, we have a target house, and we have an arrival event, which is the big fire, it presents its actions or its processes unfold within the urban interface. And it's really what happens within that urban interface and the way it unfolds around that house that really define what the house experiences. And it's very important to get the combination of those two things in perspective. And another key issue is that the environmental conditions, the weather leading up to the fire, both in the medium term, like landscape drought, drying out the soils and the plants, are also acting on the urban interface, and the houses and surrounding elements around that house are drying out for the same reasons. So when the fire does in fact turn up at its worst, the urban interface is primed and far more receptive and vulnerable to what the fire throws at it at exactly the same time. So I want to pivot a little bit and just start with this concept of the bushfire prone area and the bushfire management overlay. Now, these are the overlays that declare whether this region and their proximity to this hazard are sufficient enough to require building controls and planning controls. So I guess a bushfire prone area is essentially the region mapped across Victoria where they consider it prone enough to bushfire to warrant needing actual building controls. So it's a trigger for building controls. So it's not the area, just the area where bushfires formally can travel, like through the forest and through grasslands, but how far beyond the edge of those areas of vegetation the fires can actually reach and possibly cause a significant amount of house loss. What's interesting in that region is that it also can bring in other triggers like what you can and can't do around vegetation. So we have something called a 10-30 rule, which is a policy jargon for how much you can manage vegetation within distance limits from your structure. Now, we also have a BMO, which is a bushfire management overlay, which is a specific set of areas that, in addition to it being an area being bushfire prone, it also could exhibit more severe bushfire behaviour and potentially cause more loss, and therefore triggers additional planning controls. They might be in the form of extra setback requirements or whatever, but planning controls that are also enforced in combination with the building controls, thus trying to manage a greater level of hazard and severity of hazard on the house. And for those reasons, we have a 10-50 rule may apply in those areas, and the distances might be a little bit greater in what's prescribed. Now, what I'm going to do is take you to the website listed below there, which is actually where we can see in a mapping sense where the BPA and the BMO actually cover in Victoria. So let's go to our favourite corner of Victoria, or my favourite corner. And if we look at BPA, it actually looks fairly overwhelmingly, comprehensively the whole area of this corner of Victoria. Now, it's only really once we get down into some areas of Lakes Entrance and back that we actually have some areas that aren't directly included, and they actually might be lakes and heavily cultivated areas or urbanised areas. If we actually look at the BMO, we can see that it covers the same area, but it covers the worst of those areas, or areas where quite severe fire severity can be exhibited, and therefore obviously requires additional layers of control. So quite interesting at the drawn out level, but it's certainly relevant right into the final level. So let's zoom in around Mallacoota and have a look at how this BPA and BMO look up close. So here we are zoomed into one part of the Mallacoota township. We can see, you might recognise all your favourite locations and areas and even your own place. If we actually look at roughly where the house losses occurred in Mallacoota and surroundings, we can sort of see a breakdown of clusters of where the losses occurred. And certainly the largest loss was down in the lower extent there, where we had 39 losses, or roughly 39 losses in that large area. Just above that, we have 13 losses quite well embedded within an urban environment. And I guess that's where the fire effects spotted into and then started causing house loss and possibly some house-to-house spread as well within that area. And then there's various classic interface clusters where the bush meets the houses in some other locations. So if we actually look where the overlay meets, well, it actually, because the bushfire prone area map basically encompasses the entire area, it definitely included the areas where the losses had occurred. So rightly, regions right through Mallacoota are subject to the actions of fire and therefore are declared within the bushfire prone area. If we actually look at the bushfire management overlay, it actually is ruling in virtually all the areas except for the cluster of losses deeper within the urban environment down here where the 13 odd houses were lost. Noting that that was the region where embers spotted in and caused ignitions and some house-to-house spread and some loss within an urban environment. So in a sense, the BMO and the BPA have actually fairly correctly declared the regions where you should be concerned with building and planning controls. So there it is, just with one overlaid over the other. So we can always say that virtually in almost every circumstance, the BMO is an inclusive subset of the BPA. And of course, that's where the 1030 and the 1050 rule apply. Now, what does 1030 and 1050? Some of you may already have a deep understanding of that, but let's go through the process. So I guess if we're looking at this in cross-sectional view, we have a house and classically we have bush at some proximity to it. So one of the key challenges would be, will tree strike? And trees certainly fall over, as you'd be all aware by now, that they fall over quite prolifically in bushfire, both because of the winds associated with fire, but also because fires act on the trees and branches themselves and exploit the knots and details in the trees, and they fall over at random times during and for many hours and days after those fires. And that might hamper a house itself, but it also might hamper your ability to move through or safely near your house. So obviously some degree of consideration and removal of trees that are at risk of falling down during a fire event is needed. Not necessarily all the trees that are within tree striking distance, but the trees that would be considered at risk if a fire was to act on them. And I guess you can engage professional sort of arborists and skilled people with trees to identify which ones they are. Now, what we can do is remove those trees legally within the various schemes out to 10 metres. So that's the 10 in the 1030 rule. And we can also remove all the shrubs and undergrowth under those trees out to 30 metres for a BPA. And of course 50 metres if you're also in a BMO. So this actually provides a really interesting circumstance where we have a nice shaded area with shade suppression of the undergrowth, which actually makes it quite much easier to manage undergrowth recovery because it grows less in a shaded environment. It helps us retain some moisture in the surroundings around the structure, and it does actually offer some degree of attenuation of wind or wind action on a house. So it's potentially more beneficial to have a scene like this than necessarily clearing all the trees out to 50 metres if you're allowed to in fact even do that. And in this sort of trade-off question around the role of trees, there's actually many pros and cons, and it's certainly far more important to think about the pros and cons of trees and their role in the landscape rather than just assuming something like, you know, trees are fuel, fuel equals fire, which certainly doesn't do any justice to the arguments of what can be achieved with good landscaping. So I guess on the pro side, we have trees that can provide shade and moisture retention, and that's particularly important because in these bushfire circumstances, you really want the house and its surroundings to be one of the last things to lose all its moisture. Moisture actually helps you reduce potential for ignition when those pesky embers turn up. Wind attenuation, very important. Radiation and shielding, so they can actually block or buffer radiant heat from further out where the unmanaged bush is. They're obviously aesthetically pleasing, and they retard the growth of surface fuels to some extent. On the con side, they can be an ember source, particularly if the particular types of bark on those trees are the bad type that cause embers. So the rougher barks and the woolly barks are the real ember sources. They drop combustible debris on and around your house. So if your house actually isn't designed to be resistant to that debris build-up, then that debris is there and available for when the embers turn up. They drop combustible debris on the ground, and that causes ground and surface fuels, but that can be managed, particularly in the days, weeks and months leading up to your fire season. And of course, they bring tree strike. So an interesting mix, but definitely not a foe in my view. And of course, you know, tree strike happens at any time during the process. And I guess I recall my time when we were reviewing the losses within Wye River, and we couldn't actually even safely enter the region for 4 to 5 days after the fires had been through, simply because it took that long to make the township safe from tree strike. And wind action is a really interesting process that unfolds and is synonymous with fires. You need some significant winds in the first place to bring the fires to a township under the conditions where you're likely to lose a significant number of houses. But as you may also be aware, the fires themselves can generate convection columns and localized thunderstorms and clouds. And the convection columns actually can push up into the atmosphere and cause instabilities, which cause fairly random and inconsistent wind events that aren't necessarily in the same direction as the winds you may be expecting. And they can unfold as what we call microbursts or gusts that can be damaging in themselves, and in some cases can actually be stronger than the ambient winds on the day. Now, so what is it like in the final throes of actually fires turning up and entering into an interface? Now, here's an example from an account from the Canberra fires, where a fellow researcher of mine who actually owned the house in the foreground here, and he made some very interesting observations about what it was like for the fire to actually turn up. Now, the fire came from the bottom of the photo, and it actually came across eaten out horse paddocks. So there were completely, you couldn't actually define how little fuel was in these paddocks. There was an indistinguishable amount, and if you kick the ground, you're basically just kicking dirt. This was because Canberra had just experienced sort of a 5-year chronic drought, and they were in level 5 water restrictions, so they weren't even allowed to water their plants at all. And a fire actually trickled across this, or it sort of rolled across this event, just finding any little hints of stubble, and it turned up with pretty much an insignificant amount of fire intensity, but it turned up as a fire, and then it found all the dry fine fuels it could as very low-level dry surface fuels, and it quickly tracked through the interface and pushed in and around all the structures. So that was sort of phase 1. And then phase 2 was all of those little fine fuel surface fires that burnt through the interface, then ignited heavy fuel elements, so everything thicker than a pen, and burnt them out. So this is the fences, the power poles, the hedges, all those other aspects. And the owner of this property actually found that it was this phase of the fire that was far more threatening for his house, and he had the most trouble defending his house at that time. And I guess at that stage, you're looking at things like problematic hedges and particular trees that could play out. Fences burning up to and around, they act as wicks up between houses. And for Malcolm, looking out at the back of his house, so from the very back deck of this house, looking out in this direction, this is actually what the back fence looked like at 3:30 in the afternoon, in the thick of the fire event. Now I'll just pause there and let's have a little break and go through a few Q&As.
Justin Gale here. There's a question, Keith Mashman, about, and I'll just read it out. Are they planning on combining Victoria and New South Wales into an overview? The fire didn't notice the line on the map.
That's so very true. And the one of the big criticisms, and certainly the big debates within the Bushfire Royal Commission, was why did the fires look the same as they crossed the border, but the warnings and the predictions of where the fires were going to be and how they were going to unfold looked different. And that's because state jurisdictions issue those warnings and provide those maps. And the obvious question to I think everyone, including the states, including the researchers, including the community, was why doesn't it look the same? Isn't there one best way to do it? And that's probably what's been occupying my time and the Commonwealth government and the state government's time, is actually how to nationalise the way we model fires and issue warnings and what is best practice.
I've got another question here, Justin, just to fill the time out. Someone's asked, I can clean my block up, but what can I do about my neighbour's block that was affected by fire and the removed trees stored on the fire break next to me? So yes, everyone can take responsibility for their own properties. Do you know what the regulations are around neighbouring properties, particularly those perhaps absentee landowners or something like that?
Yeah, I think that's quite tricky depending on who your neighbour is. And I guess if your neighbour's another resident, I guess your obvious first point of call is build a healthy relationship with your neighbours and proactively discuss and debate the issues of mutual risk across a border, and that can be the vegetation, as you mentioned, but a mutual risk is also potentially your neighbour's house. Like if you're within meters of your neighbour's house, you're basically in that relationship together. If either of your houses burn down, you're going to present a formidable risk to your neighbour. So in a sense, you're all in it as a community, and you need to work those ways out. And I guess you know, if the neighbourly discussions don't actually come to fruition or aren't effective, I guess the question then is to escalate it to, you know, council and the local fire authorities to discuss what modes of enforcement and other types of stick-based motivation to remove those fuels are.
And we've got another one here from David. Are we able to get some information on the burning potential of different trees and shrubs? And you may be addressing that in the next session or in a later session. Is that available?
Yeah, I'll certainly touch on the structural characteristics of the trees and how to identify them, but I'd certainly point people to things like the CFA plant key, which starts to take you down the path of being able to look at a plant without any fundamental background in understanding species or having special lists, but it helps you understand it by simply observing plants and looking at their structural characteristics to be able to pick the good performers and the bad performers.
Terrific, thanks. Doesn't look like we've got any more questions. So if participants are having a look at this and listening and you have some questions, pop them in the Q&A down at the bottom of the screen and we'll get to them after Justin's next session. Ready to go, Justin?
So on to a specific look at the structure and its immediate surroundings. So when a fire turns up, we have primarily what we see is a lot of ember attack. In fact, ember attack is responsible for well over 90% of all the losses across Australia's history. So that's loss in absence of a big fire front turning up and causing radiant heat and flame contact. So the vast majority of houses are lost to ember attack and surface fire. One of the ways embers arrive and start to influence houses is it fills up and lands in reentrant corners, and a reentrant corner meaning, you know, pockets like this corner, because these are obvious spots where debris accumulates, and an ember is essentially a bit of glowing debris that lands in exactly the same places that debris turns up. And that creates a nice little pocket of low wind conditions, which is the scenario where fires can then develop. And if the combustible surfaces are near that accumulation of debris, well, you have a perfect scenario where fire can start to build and either burn externally or burn into a structure. If that window frame, of course, involves some decayed timber, the roughness and the reduced density and the porosity of that decayed timber makes it even easier for those embers and fires to take hold. There's even many gaps that exist in typical houses for ventilating their subfloor spaces or wall cavities, and those gaps can provide significant paths for those embers to enter. Now, the magic rule of thumb for any vents or gaps is if the gap is smaller than 2 millimeters, then the ember that can get through that gap will be so small that it really has little to no chance of igniting anything behind it. So a fine screen mesh that has an aperture of 2 mil or less is an excellent way to screen out embers, and a slot or a gap that's narrower than 2 millimeters is also good. There's lots of gaps that are apocalyptically larger than 2 millimeters, and they play out quite commonly as ways and means for those embers to enter and ignite areas such as the top of a garage door. And what do we typically store in our garage? Well, a car, but we also tend to store odds and ends that may also be combustible. The way our gutters play out in fire events is quite prolific from an ember attack point of view, because these are common places for debris to build up. Now, they do build up in the many months leading up to a fire event, and it is quite common to see in various advice to get up and clean your gutters. But unfortunately, unprotected gutters fill up significantly during the fire event as well. So we need to think of ember attack not just as a bunch of some burning embers, but it's a debris field of fine and ready to burn debris that lands in all of these spots and reaccumulates in all these spots. This is a fairly rare photo to be taken in a post-bushfire survey, because when the gutters and we have gutter fires burning with this level of severity, it's typically enough to completely ignite and burn up into a roof. Now, in this particular house, it actually had steel fascias to which the gutters were attached to, and they dramatically improved the likelihood that these gutter fires don't end up engaging the roof and becoming a roof cavity fire and causing a complete house loss. There's other interesting ways that embers can enter into a roof, and one would be around the ridge capping. So you can imagine how these roof sheets meet at the top under roof capping, and if they aren't deliberately designed to prevent ember entry, then they'll go in and they'll fall onto the typical sarking, or if there is sarking, it'll fall on the sarking. There may actually be significant debris sitting in there that's readily ignited. And also that sarking is actually the typical sarking, even the one prescribed in our building standards, will readily burn through and allow all that debris to drop, either in this case into our shed or into our roof space. There's various ways to solve that, in that you should turn up the sheet ends to help reduce the gaps, but it'd be virtually impossible to get that down to 2 millimeters. So one of the other options is to unscrew this ridge capping and screw down fiberglass bat, so glass wool bats, quite thin, and then screw that down tight on the top, which actually reduces the airflow to some extent, but blocks off and seals that ridge line from ember attack. If a fire actually gets deep into the roof space, you've actually got issues where the framing, if it happens to be timber framing, can burn and represent a significant fuel load within those cavities. And we've had many accounts of people that are using their house to survive a fire, but a roof cavity fire has developed, and the first they've known of it is when the plasterboard starts dropping in many locations around the house and virtually causes a rapid onset fire entrapment scenario for its occupants. There's other ways we can bring significant fuel load to our roof cavity, and one of those is what we typically put out as veranda covers and whatnot for shade around our houses. Now, this one has a particular type of light panels that are in this. So we've got ColourBond, but then we've got the fiberglass, which are translucent skylights, and the fiberglass ones has the visible glass fiber chop strand mat in it, and it's held together with polyester resin. So that's what's called fiberglass. Now, fiberglass, these ones are very ignitable, need quite a minor gutter fire to ignite them. And then once ignited, will spread unhindered all the way to a house and apply quite a significant flame load to a house. So they're to be avoided wherever possible in a bushfire prone area. They just simply are too combustible. Now you can actually see how a gutter fire started in the far corner, burnt in this direction, and that's why that one's already burnt to the house. This one's burnt to the house, this one's in progress. So it happened quite quickly, and thankfully a fire brigade had turned up and suppressed it at this point and saved the structure. Suitable alternatives are actually to move to polycarbonate, which doesn't and can't burn in situ and is actually a lot harder to get involved or to do anything nasty to the house. So in contrast, polycarbonate would have drooped along out near this gutter line and sagged away from the fire and not held any flame in place to any other of the secondary structures. So it would have acted in quite a benign way in comparison. The types of fuel loads we have around our houses is also a key issue. This is a particularly interesting scenario where a house had been recently built to the latest regulations in Sydney, and it had been built to Bell 40, or actually Bell 29, and it had toughened glass windows, and it had only recently been finished. So the garden beds hadn't been planted out, but they had put down wood chip mulch in those garden beds in preparation for planting. Now, when the fire turned up, the embers actually ignited the tambark garden beds, and that was enough radiant heat on these windows, not to break the windows because they were the better rated toughened glass windows, but they were enough to actually melt the plastic blinds behind the windows as a demonstration of how much heat that seemingly insignificant amount of fuel load would represent. Now, there's two reasons why it's presenting quite a significant heat load. It's because it's quite thick and burns for some time, but it's a large area also that will burn all at once next to the house. So that's pretty much an unacceptable amount of fuel that's not ruled out or managed by any regulation. It's only a good deep understanding by people living in bushfire prone areas that are going to manage that risk. And of course, there's other typical fuel loads that we tend to bolt onto our houses in terms of decking, which are readily ignited and burn quite prolifically in these bushfire events. Even the detailing of around a simple post in a classic stirrup is a common way for embers to land or surface fires to enact and play on these areas. And you can imagine the way these stirrups and the actual post interplay. It's a common place for debris to land and sit under the end of those stirrups. Now, in this case, this is a treated pine post, and treated pine would have to be one of the most combustible timbers that you could put anywhere near your house. It's very easy to ignite, and it will burn to completion unless a lot of water is put on it. And unfortunately, when it burns, it also delivers quite a lot of toxic ash into the soil. And that toxic ash, which is, if you think of CCA treated pine, stands for copper, chrome, arsenic. Well, those metal salts are persistent salts that cause the soil to be quite toxic for months and years afterwards. And it's actually quite dangerous to even touch and interact with if you're sifting through the damage around a house or a damaged house. Yeah, there's many places where this sort of interaction with floors and ground interact in outside decks. And under houses, the typical ways we close up raised floor housing. The things we put on our decks can themselves be significant fuel loads that interact. And there's also some really interesting observations around some decking designs that are actually quite resistant to fire. So in this case, this was in Wye River, where we had a deck that was supported by a steel support structure, so itself non-combustible, and on it was a wood composite decking specifically designed for bushfire. So I think this one was a Modwood brand, and Modwood produce a bushfire resisting and tested timber decking product. and it's actually done very well to survive the fire and the burning out of an adjacent treated pine retaining wall, which applied quite a lot of heat to the deck, yet the deck didn't get involved and add further fuel to the structure. Our classic stairs are also a risk, and if you think about the re-entrant corner case, the typical treads and stringers on a chair on a set of stairs is a common place for those embers to exploit and start to burn. And I guess we also notice certain stair designs that simply are quite tolerant in bushfires. And in contrast, here we have a gel steel support system with single isolated treads. And because it's not timber to timber meeting to form pockets where the embers exploit, in contrast, the treads are relatively undamaged, despite the fact that the adjacent house had actually burned down for other reasons. There's also many things that are typically present around houses during fires, such as wheelie bins and the rubbish that's stored within them. And the proximity of those to houses can in themselves be enough to ignite a house that would otherwise survive. Where we place our vehicles, and vehicles, I mean cars, boats, caravans, camper trailers, all those movable objects, their proximity to a house is key. Typically, if you look at the size or dimension of the vehicle, it wants to be at least that dimension away from the house before it starts to be far enough away not to present a direct radiant heat and possible flame contact risk to the structure. Stored tyres, building materials, timber, all can play out and burn quite aggressively next to structures. Treated pine, once again, here's a retaining wall that began to burn out because of a surface fire, suppressed, and which more or less captures the severity and the potential threat it posed to an adjacent structure. Complete burnout of treated pine retaining walls, even the timber that's hard up against soil, therefore has a reasonable amount of soil moisture or moisture in it that it gains from the soil, doesn't prevent CCA treated pine from burning out. It will burn even when it's wet. Where do we store our materials? Certainly in the case of Wye River, the built on quite steep areas, the typical place to keep stored things dry is under your structure. Those present, that stored material presents a massive load to a house, and that heat load, that when that burns out, even a regulated house has little to no chance of resisting that exposure. We've even found a few examples where you can put sheds under houses, which is an interesting dilemma, given that sheds are lost at a rate of about 3 to 1 to houses in bushfires, simply because they're A, not ember proof, and B, quite prolific in the landscape. So it's very common to lose garden sheds and detached garages. And of course, we've got stored fuels in those sheds or on decks and around, and stored propane gas bottles as well. And they play out in particular ways in these fire events. Now, most of these have been heated up to the point where they've flared. And in one case here, we can see a particular gas bottle that's actually ruptured. And that's typical of what happens when a gas bottle is able to fall over during a fire and then continue to be heated. So when any of these propane bottles actually fall over, they lose the ability to be able to vent properly and vent gas, which is their way of trying to stay cool. So if they're releasing high pressure gas, it has a refrigerating or cooling effect on the gas inside, which prevents the pressure vessel getting to a temperature where it can burst. If they fall over, they can burst, and when they do, that is an incredibly violent explosion that can shatter windows and threaten people's lives within a perimeter of out to 50 to 100 meters. So the way they're secured is particularly important. Here's an example of some of a house that was built to regulation, and this is the entry driveway. And here we have just on the end of that driveway here, their gas supply, which is quite well configured on a concrete slab with a supported steel structure and metal chains holding those upright. So there's very little risk of these being able to actually fall over during the event. But unfortunately, in this configuration, the treated pine retaining walls that had burned up behind these propane gas bottles was enough heat to cause them to flare. And of course, they flared straight out across the driveway, straight at the house. So threatening exit of anyone in the house, but also being a sufficient amount of heat to the house that even though it was built to regulation, it couldn't withstand that kind of heat. And of course, I need to actually go to some American photos to actually show some prolific landscape house-to-house spread. And they certainly take the Guernsey for building their neighbourhoods with houses so close together, with so vulnerable structure-to-structure spread potential, that when they start to lose houses in certain urban interfaces, they can lose entire suburbs because the fire can just burn unhindered from structure to structure from one end of a suburb to another, and it really needs a large streetscape to actually pull up a fire. Now that's mainly because the houses are built even more lightweight than our lightest weight houses, but they're built very close to each other, and the urban density is quite high. So that's an issue that we always need to think about when we see quite dense construction immediately near bushfire-prone areas. And the building regulations, most importantly, do not account for the potential exposure from a house-to-house ignition. So if you put two regulated houses together, even though they're both built to the current bushfire regulations, if one of those houses happen to burn down for any reason, the other house will almost certainly burn down unless a fire brigade turns up and prevents one house spreading to the other. And we've found that that residents with the means they typically have to defend in a bushfire that don't have the means to actually prevent one house burning its neighbour down when it's at that typical minimum separation distance, which is in many of the built-up suburbs here in Melbourne, it approaches something like 1.8 metres of wall-to-wall separation. In Wye River, we actually found that houses had the potential to actually burn another house down at distances up to 12 metres. Now, here's a regulated house that was pretty much at the point of being lost from a neighbouring house, and the separation is 12 metres, and you can see the radiant heat damage on that structure from that exposure. Now, 12 metres is an extraordinary distance for us, even as researchers, to comprehend that one house could possibly take out a neighbour. But the important thing about Wye River was that the fires came in, many houses were burning, but the winds dropped, and this house-to-house exposure occurred under low wind conditions. So the winds were no longer cooling the neighbouring houses down while it was getting heated from radiant heat from its neighbour. So yeah, loss is possible up to 12 metres. If we look closely, you can actually see the toughened glass window pretty much losing its plastic beading and being quite heated, and the cracks in the fire resistant cladding. And that's actually fire resistant non-timber subfloor enclosure. And this was another example that was quite similar, also 12 metres of separation from its neighbour. But the striking thing about this example was this lily-pilly tree that happened to be present between the two houses and effectively shielded the back half of this house. So you can see in contrast, direct radiant heat to the front half, and in fact losing the first panel of these two windows, second window untouched, and the back half of the house, no significant radiant heat damage. So this lily-pilly, while it was quite healthy and green at the time of the fire, didn't interact with the fire because it was one of the better performers. It probably wouldn't perform that well now that it was being so heat stressed, and it is all scorched and desiccated now. So it probably represents a significant fuel load now that it's all stressed. But in its presence, it actually blocked enough radiant heat. Now, if we look at that, and if you can see, possibly you could see maybe 50% of the house through that tree, well, that's actually the amount of radiant heat that can block. So that will roughly halve the radiant heat that that house experiences, because so visual obscuration, what you can see through is exactly how radiant heat obscuration works, which is a good rule of thumb for working out the relative benefit of the trees between you and the bush. And I'll just leave you with this last example of a loss scenario in Wye River. This was a really interesting house that was built to regulation. It had been occupied for 6 months, and it was built to Bell 40. And when we looked it up on holiday accommodation, which is a great research tool for understanding how houses looked before the fires, they were bragging about it being Bell 40 plus. So it was built better than Bell 40. And we were really scratching our heads over that, because we're looking at it and going, yes, but it's a timber clad house. Surely you can't clad a house in timber for Bell 40. And then we looked into it in more detail and realized that they'd built using what they call a Bell FZ, which is the next level up building requirement, so Bell Flame Zone, which required a fire-resisting cladding. And then there was nothing particular in the building standard that said you couldn't then put a decorative cladding over the top of that. And in this case, they chose timber. And that was still technically an acceptable solution in AS 3959. So while it made no practical sense, it was actually technically compliant. So what do you know? The fires actually found the typical fuel loads around the houses. They'd even had some fuel loads in the presence of some retaining walls, and that amount of heat was enough to get the cladding going. And in fact, it was probably this pocket here that was the worst case scenario, where we had debris, a treated pine retaining wall, and it right adjacent to combustible cladding. So embers landed here, burned up the cladding, applied flame to the Bell 40 windows, which aren't flame resistant, and of course ended the house and took the house out. So that's the aftermath of that house burning out. Now I'll leave it there and look forward to some more questions.
Thanks, Justin. That's tremendous. A question that's a little bit dear to my heart as well. Always interested in roofs and how they work and what we can do to protect them. Rob's asking, we have a metal roof with high gutters which regularly fill with leaves from quite distant trees. We keep them clean. I still worry about ember attack from gutters and ridge and valley lines. Are my concerns real? And some gutter guards are gutter traps for leaves and twigs. Are there proven products for retrofitting guards for gutters, ridge and valleys, exposed windows, etc.? What are the specifications around aftermarket or retrofitting protection to gutters and valleys, such things? Go with that one to start with.
Sure. So I guess we have to think back, well, if we've got a metal roof and metal gutters, what is really the issue? And now the issue is obviously what is the gutter attached to, and if things burnt in the gutter, where do the flames go and how do they track up into the roof space? Now, firstly, they do and can track up under the roof sheets and start playing against the fascia board or the framing for which the fascia board's attached. So the trick is to either prevent debris getting in the gutter in the first place, or having a strategically set up deflector that sits in the back of the gutter and kicks up and kicks forward, so that as flames come up from the debris in the gutter, it simply hits a metal kick face that can't track up into it. Now, I've never seen that design sold as a practical product anywhere, but I reckon that's one of the most interesting practical long-term designs to prevent the whole thing unfolding badly. But really, one of the deeper and more practical things to do is do away completely with your timber fascias. The timber fascias are the Achilles heel in that process. And while you're replacing out your timber fascias, think about that improvised kick panel that prevents the flames tracking right up into your roof. And then I guess the other part of that question is sort of moving on to gutter guards and pursuing the idea that you can possibly eliminate all the debris from being in your gutters at the particular time. And in a sense, that is a challenging process that is difficult to get to the end of, because as you pointed out, gutter guards do retain debris on the roof and they can let some through. But if you're going to pick the best of the gutter guards, it needs to be a fine mesh. The aperture needs to be smaller than 2 mil, and it needs to attach to the gutter and your roof in ways that don't melt or degrade or peel back when heated. So it's almost like they have to be crimped or clamped at both ends, and it's difficult to find the particular brands and installers that can do it that well, but it's maybe possible. Maybe not in your area, but you have to keep looking to find that solution. And of course, earlier on in the presentation, I detailed how you solve the ridgeline problem. It's not as easy at the gutter line, although if you are prepared to unscrew and lift your roof sheets, there are some various things you can either clamp down between your fascia, which is hopefully replaced as a non-combustible fascia, to the roof sheet with either a special convoluted thing or obviously compressing the glass wool blanket down. So yeah, it's a bit of a deep dive, but you really have to get your head around what you're trying to solve and then get onto it. The other novel thing is not so novel, is to fill up all your gutters with water, so that anything that falls into them becomes wet and therefore doesn't develop to be a problem. But I've seen, I'd suggest you follow direct delivery of water into the gutters rather than thinking about putting choppers along your roof, because a lot of water never gets to the windy side of your roof.
Yep, terrific. Special interest of mine, 2009, our house burnt down from, it started catching, it caught fire initially from embers getting into the ridge line. And I've played in the business for many years, and I still had this crazy idea, now crazy, thought it was great before, that embers kind of fell like snow and sort of just dropped onto the roof and ran down a steep pitch. When you've got wind speeds over 100 kilometres an hour, the embers land and go back up the steep pitched roof and lodge under the ridgeline. And of course, that's just after, I think our house was 40 years old. And we had some trees around, and the dry debris after 13 years of drought, it was kindling under the roof, and that caught fire and was caused us some grief, and ultimately we lost our house to it. So yeah, the roof stuff's really important. Solving the sprinklers isn't the best solution unless you've got really, really cleverly designed sprinkler system. Gail, do you want to throw another question to Justin?
Yeah, this is one I would have asked actually. Based on your lily-pilly example and the shielding it provided, should we be looking at providing green, moist vegetation shields near our windows? Thanks for the question.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great concept, and I guess you need to think about the strategic plant and its ultimate size. It's not just because it's green, because there are certain green plants that aren't particularly good, like don't build a cypress pine hedge past your window, which obviously looks nice and green, but when you part it, it's full of fine debris and probably one of the worst performers ever. So definitely go to the better end of the plant selection key and pick your special plants, and then think very carefully about what you put under those plants. So a good plant in isolation is going to act in a very benign way, but if you put a big bark chip ground cover or allow a lot of debris to build up under it, it's not going to do as well.
Terrific, thanks, Justin. Rob's got another question regarding the 10-30-10-50 rule, and that's with respect to crown fires. And even if you clear the undergrowth under the trees, is there a likelihood of crown fire? And do we need to actually have a tree break somewhere in the forest?
Sure. So a crown fire is a fire that burns from the ground right through all of the near surface fuels, intermediate fuel layer, and right up into the crown. Now, crown fires only really occur when there's enough fuel on the ground and in the intermediate layers to have flames that are long enough to reach the crown. When they reach the crown, they simply find more fuel and then project further, hence a crowning fire, which reaches out the top of a forest. If you don't have the surface fuels and don't have the intermediate fuels, you don't have an appropriate seat for the fire to develop that full structure right up through the crowns. Now, the crown itself can't really sustain a raging fire in it for any significant distance without that ground support. Therefore, it will decay and drop and not continue or track right through. Now, there are some scenarios where that's not exactly true, and particularly on very steep slopes and very steep fire runs where the flame lengths are so long, they can reach across or through quite a lot of crown before they pop out the top, or they actually attach to the ground and run like a massive raging ground fire. But those slopes are quite aggressive, like up around in the 30 degrees plus. But other than those scenarios, the fires don't rage through crowns in isolation. It just simply doesn't happen.
Terrific. Gail?
Just a sort of a comment, great comment here from Keith Mashman. He says, I use gel Barricade 2 to protect the gutters, windows, and skylights. Next time I will do the ridge capping. I was lucky this time, I reckon.
Oh yeah, so Barricade gel, yep. It's quite a thick, tacky goo that goes on to structures, for the people that aren't aware of it. It can, when put on thick enough, fill those gaps, and it can cover various combustible features that then will not burn until that gel actually is fully dried out, desiccates, and then of course combustion can occur. Useful for the short passage of the fire, a little less effective if you've got, say, a long duration fire like an adjacent house fire that's only meters away. But it has to be hydrated and fairly fresh to do a really good job. Bit of a challenge in the cleanup processes, so be careful about the process of getting it back off and doing a complete cleanup. Follow the directions very carefully and get used to it, and also watch out for the slipperiness of your immediate landscape once applied, and also in the days afterwards when it gets rehydrated, it'll sort of create quite a lot of slip risk.
That's great. That's the end of the questions, unless anyone has any more. If you have another question, just drop your mouse cursor down to the bottom and go to the Q&A and pop a question in there. This is being recorded and will be on the MADRA website at some stage, and I'm sure that you can put questions in there. I think we're hoping to have Justin back for another one of these, which will be more around how to protect your own property, how to retrofit your property. But in the meantime, we'll throw back to Lyn to wrap up and do all that administrative stuff around getting onto the MADRA website and asking more questions, and where to from now. Back to you, Lyn.
Justin, that's absolutely fabulous. I've actually heard bits and pieces of your presentation before, and every time more information seems to filter into the brain and stick there. So those of you who have listened to this, you will be able to look at it again on the recording on the MADRA site. And I think that, you know, some of those very quite complex answers that Justin has given are worth a second go to, you know, have a think about what polycarbon is and so on and so forth. So I do suggest that you go onto the MADRA website and pick it up again. And yes, Justin, we're hoping that we can get you back again in the future to talk a little bit more about actually retrofitting houses and doing the last few jobs to really make them a lot safer. It's been terrific. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and probably on the 8th of December, we will have our next webinar. So keep that night, that evening 3. And thank you all for joining us.